by 1968, the Americans had gotten very, very close to achieving their goal of landing a man on the moon by the end of the decade. And in October, Apollo 7 flew and tested out the Apollo Command and Service Module in low Earth orbit. The only thing that really needed to be tested after that to go to the moon was the lunar module. And the lunar module, there were a lot of problems with it. It hadn't been easy to construct. Of course, no one had ever done it before. And it was severely behind schedule. Probably wouldn't be able to fly at least until the following spring. And because of that, from October until the lunar module was finally ready, there wasn't scheduled to be another Apollo mission. And NASA felt, well, this is kind of a waste of time. We're only working on one thing. Why don't we, in the time that we have, improvise an Apollo mission and accomplish some mission objectives that we still have waiting? So, with only 4 months to prepare, NASA decides that Apollo 8 should go into lunar orbit in December. This was the first time that a manned spacecraft had left Earth orbit for deep space. 4 months is not a long time to change a mission, much less start one from scratch. Jim McDivitt and his crew of Rusty Schweickart, Dave Scott, were removed from the crew of Apollo 8, which was supposed to test fly the lunar module when it was finally ready. They were bumped up to the next flight. And Frank Borman, Jim Lovell and Bill Anders were selected to fly on Apollo 8. They hadn't got any of the software. They couldn't even simulate their flight to the moon. And this was also the first manned flight of their rocket, their giant Saturn V rocket, which would take all future crews to the moon. And the reasons for sending Apollo 8 to the moon kept on building up and building up and building up. They knew that if they wanted to get to the moon by the end of next year, they had to know if they can get there now. So on December 21st, 1968, the enormous Saturn V rocket, which is still the most powerful machine that man has ever devised, was placed upon pad 39A, NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida, and the three astronauts, Borman, Lovell and Anders, climbed atop the rocket, 363 foot high. It's the size of a 35-story office building and carries 1 million gallons of rocket fuel. When they got ignition, 7.5 million pounds of rocket thrust propelled the vehicle into the sky, into the Florida sky. And they go up into Earth orbit, and they go around the Earth once, and again that's a busy time because you want to make sure that everything that you need to go to the moon is working perfectly. And this was the point where, for Bill Anders, things started to go, for Frank Borman, sorry, things started to go a little bit wrong because he was a little bit sick. The zero gravity gives you a kind of motion sickness which is very difficult to get over. So basically it was a mess inside the spacecraft, not very good, and this caused a whole controversy of maybe we could bring the crew home, but no, they're on their way to the moon. We need to carry on. So they do their TLI burn, their translunar injection burn with the rocket motor that they have in their S4B stage, and that propels them out of Earth orbit towards the moon. It takes them 4 days to get to the moon and arrive there on Christmas Eve. They don't actually, as they come in, this is one of the more interesting parts of the flight, because looking at the diagrams, people often think that you just fire straight at the moon. Well, it's not that at all, because the Earth is moving, the moon is moving, and you need to aim it as a moving target. So the moon's coming along here, and you have to aim it out here so that the two meet. And that means that so that you don't just shoot right by, you have to interrupt your trajectory, and that involves a lunar orbit insertion burn using the massive engine that you have in the command module. And so as they're coming in, they need to fire this engine. They didn't see the moon until after they were there. They do their 5-minute, 22-second burn, and then everyone has to wait to see if Apollo 8 has successfully travelled their 250,000 miles, aiming for a spot 60 miles in diameter. And as Apollo 8 goes around the far side of the moon blocks their radio transmission, so they're completely out of touch with people back on Earth. And this was one of the most apprehensive moments in the whole history of NASA, because they really didn't know if the crew had survived, if they shot right past the moon, if they crashed into the moon, or the vehicle itself could have exploded and they would never have known what happened. But as it turns out, I think they came out within 1.5 miles of where they were supposed to be, so it was pretty good. And as they came around the back of the moon, just before they regained radio contact with Houston, their mission control center in Houston, Texas, Bill Anders was tinkering about with a camera in front of one of their windows, and he was just putting film on the camera ready to take photographs of landing sites for future Apollo missions. And so he has this camera in his hand. He's just glancing out the window, looking at the moon. And as he's looking out, he sees on the lunar horizon a little blue smudge, just on the horizon, and that smudge gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And Bill Anders has just become the first man to see, with his own eyes, an Earthrise. The entire planet Earth, from his perspective, was rising up over the lunar horizon. He's just looking at this thing, and he looks at it for a minute, and he just says to himself, "Oh my God," seeing the whole Earth rising above the horizon. And then the other two crew members, Jim and Frank, see this, and they just start staring at it. And then Jim Lovell starts saying, "Whoa, are you getting any of this on camera?" So there's a big scramble for cameras, and fortunately for Bill Anders, he had a colour film and a long lens. And the picture that he snapped off was one of the most famous and important pictures taken during that entire century, the Earthrise photograph, seeing the Earth as it really is. And it's tiny out there. It's inconsequential. It is just a tiny little blue marble. And Jim Lovell recollects that when you're in lunar orbit, you can put your thumb up and cover the whole Earth behind your thumb. You know, your loved ones, your business, the problems of the Earth itself, all behind your thumb. And how insignificant we really all are. Apollo 8 orbited the moon 10 times over the course of a day. And about 2 hours before they were scheduled to make their TEI burn, trans-Earth injection, they make a live television broadcast back to the Earth. And so they basically say what it's like to be in lunar orbit. And then at the end, as they're about to wrap off, Frank Borman takes out a piece of fireproof paper from the back of their flight manual, because he has a message that he wants to send back to the people of the Earth. And he starts to read from the piece of fireproof paper. And he says, "In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep." And he continued to read through the book of Genesis, and then he said, "And God said, let there be light, and there was light." And each member of the crew read out a verse from the first volume of the book of Genesis. Then at the end, Frank Borman says, "We close with good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good earth. And he finishes off his television broadcast and signs off. And 2 hours later, again, the spacecraft passes behind the moon in order to... You light your rocket, you do it behind the moon so that you can accumulate enough velocity that the moon swings you around and takes you back towards the Earth. And Chris Kraft, who was a flight director at NASA, said that that was the most apprehensive time that he ever spent mission control, seeing the vehicle disappear behind the moon for the 10th time to come home. And again, there was this interval of about 20 minutes when no one knew anything of Apollo 8. It was behind the moon, and then of course she emerges and starts on her way home. And you continually accelerate, you fall back to the Earth, and when you finally arrive, you need to do this re-entry, because you have this heat shield in the back. As you go into the Earth's atmosphere at 25,000 miles an hour, you begin to heat up because of the friction in the air. These atoms are hitting your heat shield so fast that it creates a huge amount of heat. And this heat shield is just made of cork, the kind of stuff that you get in the top of wine bottles. As they're coming in, you dig into the Earth's atmosphere a little bit to slow down. Then you roll over 180 degrees to relieve the heat load. Then you roll back in. It's like a roller coaster coming down this, and then you're finally going slow enough that you're dropping straight down. And then these three big parachutes open. Huge explosion again as these three main parachutes open, and then they come down, landed in the Central Pacific, and it was pitch dark in a rough sea, and they landed, and these little balloons hadn't deployed that keeps the thing upright, so they were upside down. Frank Borman got seasick and threw up all over Anders and Lovell. So that was the humble end to a great mission.